Welcome to episode 186 of Sports Geek. On this week's episode, I discuss leadership, trust, and culture with Cameron Schwab.
Welcome to Sports Geek, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host, who could potentially sign LeBron James. He's just clearing cap room, Sean Callanan.
Thanks, DJ Joel. Yes, I might actually just put up a LeBron James billboard here in Richmond and see if we can clear some cap space to bring him to Australia. My name is Sean Callanan, and you are listening to Sports Geek. This is one of our CEO series episodes where I catch up with Cameron Schwab, who has been an AFL CEO with 3 clubs over 25 years. We talk about his career in the AFL and what the role of CEO demands of you. So it was really good to catch up with Cameron. And also after the conversation, in the conversation itself, he talks about a workshop which I attended last night. So after the conversation with Cam, I will talk about that. As always, if you're listening for the first time, thank you very much. My name is Sean Callanan from Sports Geek. You may be listening to this on sportsgeekhq.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. Thank you for doing so. If you've left a review, a double thank you. As always, if you ever want to work with me or have a chat, find out how potentially Sports Geek can help you. I help chatting with and helping podcast listeners. You can simply go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call. Type that in, you'll get a link. Book a time in my calendar and we'll have a chat. But right now, here is my chat with Cameron Schwab of Design CEO. Very happy to be here at Sports Geek, here at the offices of Creative Cubes with the founder and CEO of Design CEO, Cameron Schwab. Welcome to the podcast.
It's terrific to be here, and it's great to have the conversation about how your business is going too. I've watched it emerge as well. You were one of the pioneers obviously in the social media world initially. I remember you were talking about it before anyone was talking about it, and now you're probably a veteran of something which it's very hard to be a veteran in. I
do. I actually do remember, I guess, one of our first meetings when you were, and we'll get into your backstory in a minute for the people who don't know your story, but I think it was very early on in Sports Geek. It was sort of when I was always... it's a bit of a brand story. So I think early on I was trying to figure out what the Sports Geek brand was, and I didn't have the custom shoes yet, and I was trying to say, Sports Geek and that kind of thing, and I was rocking the jeans with the tracksuit top to try to give that sports feel, and then I've come into I think it was the MCG where your offices were to meet you as CEO of Melbourne, and I came out of that meeting. It was a good meeting and chatting about how we're both using Twitter and trying to understand what social was. And I came out of that meeting going, the feel wasn't quite right. Here you were in your suit and tie going about your day-to-day business, and here I was still trying to, the brand, if it was, still in its infancy. And I think I came out of that and I sort of started to solidify what it was, and so it was. I'm still going to wear jeans. Sneakers are going to be my thing, but when I'm in meetings or speaking and that kind of thing, it'll be a jacket and not a tie. I didn't go to a full tie, but shirt and jacket and a little bit more upscale in my look in going about it. And
but it was the Melbourne Football Club. You weren't walking into Collingwood. It was Melbourne, so we are talking about a place where you're still expected to wear a jacket and tie, and if probably by preference you would have a few patches on the sleeves as well of the tweed jacket.
I have got a jacket with the patches on the elbows, so that's a little bit of a backstory of, I guess, our first meeting and sort of how we cross paths from a social point of view. But for the people who don't know, and if people listening in the US or in Europe, you've got a long career as a football CEO. You were named CEO of Richmond Football Club at the age of 24, and then have had and been CEO of 3 clubs, and at Melbourne twice.
Yeah.
I guess going back to that, being a CEO at 24.
Yeah.
Like how does that come about? Back in just for again context, 1988.
Yeah, so a long time ago, obviously, and the game's changed, but perhaps in many ways. People always talk about how the game's actually evolved and how the game's changed, but generally it evolves or changes in a way where it sets the pattern for change, of which the game has often done, or it immediately follows. And even at that time, perhaps what the number one thing people were seeking from their CEOs was actually some form of acumen in the sport itself. And because I'd grown up with the game, my father, Alan Schwab, was probably at that time the best known football administrator in the country. His brother umpired a grand final and Frank Schwab, and Frank Schwab's son, Peter Schwab, was actually playing for Hawthorn at that time. He was a premiership player. So my name was well known in the sporting world, and I'd got into recruiting at a time when the game was changing quite dramatically. It was when drafting and those things first came into what was then the VFL.
Yeah, so the abolition of zones and
so
player assessment, all of that kind of stuff was starting to kick in.
I lived through the two systems. So I was doing the recruiting at the time when you had to do what we call the scon run, where you'd go around to the families of your players in your country zone to try and convince them to come and play for your club, of which at that time I was recruiting manager of Melbourne Football Club, and doing the scon run meant going to Gary Lyons' family or Rod Grinter's family, these guys who then went on and had long careers at the Melbourne Football Club. Silvio Fascini case happens in 1993. He takes the rules basically to court, wins, and the AFL has to come up with an alternative, which morphed over probably a period of 2 or 3 years into now what we see as drafting. And so I'm living that period as a recruiting guy, which was a period of great opportunity because all of a sudden the rules are loosened up and I'm an enthusiastic young guy, driving around, country Victoria or getting on aeroplanes whenever the club could afford it to try and convince players to come and play for your club. So it was a great experience. And it meant that I'd probably done my 10,000 hours because I was one of the first recruiters. I was one of the first recruiters in the AFL. Noel Judkins had been doing it for a long time at Essendon.
Yep.
They'd stolen the march because of that. It seemed amazing that there was such a lag before other clubs started doing likewise. I was a young guy around the club. Ron Barassi's coach, Ray Jordan's assistant coach. These are great names in the sport. Barry Richardson was chairman of selectors. And I got the opportunity as basically going from the office boy to be the recruiting person, and I was only 19 or 20 at that time. And I was watching a lot of footy on video and also surrounded by the game and with some of the most remarkable mentors in the sport, with my father and guys like Ron and Ray Jordan. And we went from having not played in the finals, Melbourne, for close to 25 years to playing in a preliminary final and making the grand final. And at that point, I'm 24. A guy by the name of Paddy Ganone. I was just watching. I can remember it vividly. I was watching a game at the Junction Oval in Melbourne, and Paddy's a big, tall, quite imposing figure. Wandered up beside me, started up a conversation, asked whether I'd have any interest in working for the Tigers, and I assumed it would be in recruiting.
Yep.
At that stage, I was pretty happy with what I was doing, and then he mentioned, "No, we'd like you to be what was then the general manager of the club, or want to know if you're interested in being the general manager." And there's part of me which couldn't quite believe it, but there was probably another part of me where I just started thinking that perhaps that might be a realistic career ambition. It was just presenting itself probably 10 years earlier than what I thought it would. I gave it some thought, probably because I had the reassurance of my father in his belief in me, and also the recognition that perhaps if I ever found myself out of my depth, at least I knew I had a really strong mentor and someone I could seek their support, and decided to take it on. And they're pretty dark days for the Tigers as well. We're on the bottom and broke, and so it wasn't just taking on a leadership role. It was taking on a leadership role with a pretty high expectation. One of the best supported clubs in the competition, but the club was on its knees in lots of ways. So it was a marvellous opportunity, and I look at it now as probably the thing which shaped me as a leader, more than any other experience that I've had since.
And so it was very much a case of, learning on the job and taking taking the recruitment experience that you'd had and what had worked, but then there's those other parts to the portfolio that come when you're running a whole club.
The mistake I made, Sean, is I didn't use my recruiting. I didn't use that background. I had a belief that a leader should behave in a certain way, and because I was young, the people who were my peers in other AFL clubs or peers in leadership roles that I was aware of had come out of a very different way of thinking than perhaps my generation was going to lead a little bit, and has been certainly taken up another notch by the next generation. But the people who were working in and around leadership roles at that time had come very much out of, they were baby boomers whose influence had been probably military as much as anything. It was a very much a command control way of leading, and I tried to be like that.
Yep.
And it just didn't suit me at all. It wasn't my way.
It's like an ill-fitting suit.
It was, yeah. And so, the thing is, you can't be, and there's a lot of talk now about the need to have authenticity in your leadership. Well, you can't have any level of authenticity in your leadership if you're not leading in a way which is true to your own values and your own beliefs. And I was looking at the people around me, and this was sort of fire and brimstone type leadership.
Yep.
And I never carried on in that way, but I had an expectation. Everyone said, the biggest concern I think people had of me was whether I was going to be hard enough or tough enough. So I felt there was a need to try and display that. I overcompensated. Not necessarily in a...
You were trying to be the leader that you thought everyone wanted you to be.
Yeah, and I thought that's what the behaviour... And it wasn't actually until... It was probably 12, 18 months in, I thought, well, the real skills that I'd actually got from recruiting was the capacity to build relationships, to build trust, to back your judgment, to assess strategically what you actually needed as an organisation, to try and match capability against ambition. These sorts of things were at the core of what I was doing from a recruiting point of view, although I didn't probably understand that at the time. And it wasn't until I started to bring that back into my way of leading that I actually built any form of self-belief and any form of confidence. And so I needed to leverage what I actually understood rather than trying to leverage what I understood leadership, some perverse view of leadership that I actually had.
Yep.
And remember, I'd only worked 5 or 6 years. My only other job other than working in footy was as a paper boy, really.
Yep.
So it wasn't as though didn't do any uni, I didn't do any of those things. So really, it was, as you said, learning on the job, but at the same time, failing to recognise the need for me to learn or to leverage the things that I knew and understood, and therefore had some capability in.
And so, I chatted with Nigel Smart, who went through as a player, went through the amateur's not the right word, but went from not professional to fully professional.
Yeah.
That same evolution happened off the field as well in that time. What was it like go from I'm managing a footy club in the same way that suburban footy clubs get managed to I'm managing a business? What was that transition like? I
think you're always managing a business. So just the nature of the business changed in that it actually became easier in lots of ways, because what would actually happen when I first became a CEO is the players would start turning up at about 3:30, 4 o'clock, 4:30. Even Kevin Bartlett was coach; he was full time, but there were still coaches who weren't full time during that era. I think Kevin was Richmond's first full time coach. I don't think Tony Jewell was full time the year before, or if he was, it was only for a short period. And so what would actually happen is you'd get into work at your normal day. You'd often have early morning meetings because it was very much everyone else's part-time association, whether it was board members, whether it was volunteers, and the clubs were very volunteer-based. And then the players would rock up at that time, and the day would finish. They'd have match committee or whatever meetings, or your board meetings would start at 6 o'clock or these things. So you basically were often working 12, 13, 14-hour days, and which then transcended by the time you played games on weekends, and you had under-19s as well, so you'd watch them play. It wasn't unusual to be doing 80, 90, 100-hour weeks. So when the game actually became professional, we actually started to operate remotely within what people would consider normal working hours. Yep. So even the board meetings, for instance, started taking place during the course of the day. So from that point of view, at least you're able to manage your involvement, you manage your life in some shape or form. But the biggest change was, as much as anything, is having a expectation that in fact mirrored what almost the external expectation of the sport was, that we're beating our chest saying we're a professional sport but really still operating in an amateur fashion. And the game will always sit on a little bit of a balance there. I think it was William Wrigley Jr. back in the day, I think it was 1922 quote, where he said, business is too much of a sport to be, baseball's too much of a sport to be a business and too much of a business to be a sport. And it probably still sits in that space somewhere.
Yep.
But when it basically, when it started to have a responsibility in terms of mirroring or leading on what we would consider to be high community values, that's where the real change started to happen. Nicky Winmayer lifting his jumper in 1993. That's when the game started to take itself, far more seriously in that sense. And I think it was then that we started to realise that the things that we half turned a blind eye to, or we thought were half okay, we started to think, well, no, they're not okay. And it was up to us as leaders to actually make that change. And that meant, in many cases, reflecting on our own personal behaviours and our values, as much as it was, recognising that we had to lead the sport in that regard.
So you spent a long time in Melbourne, in the Melbourne sports scene, and to a certain degree, the Melbourne sports bubble, both being at two long history clubs in Richmond and Melbourne.
Yeah.
What was it like going to the other side of the country to still then a relatively new club, Fremantle being one of the expansion clubs in footy heartland that is Perth? What was the experience like on the other side of the country?
It was a wonderful experience at so many levels. First of all, I think the opportunity to live away from your day-to-day support group is a terrific thing. It was a great thing for us as a family, but it was also it was greenfields from Fremantle's point of view. I was fortunate that before, in my recruiting time, I would regularly go and watch the local derbies, the East Fremantle, South Fremantle derby. So I had a real sense of what, there was a genuine sophistication and understanding of the sport, and that was being played out in quite a passionate way through those games. And I just felt that Fremantle, the club, hadn't quite embraced its uniqueness, from that point of view. And it's not unusual. Your first thought when you're building a sporting franchise is you want to please a lot of people. You want to get the numbers in. Whereas actually what is probably more important is that you have a core of those who are just absolute believers for all the reasons that they do, because what your club does is represent them in a way. And there was certainly enough of those in Fremantle who hadn't quite
latched on.
No, they hadn't expressed their passion for the game through the Fremantle Football Club. They'd only won 2 games that year, and they'd lost, I think, 18 or 19 games in a row. And so they're playing in front of small crowds, Subiaco Oval. They've got a major, major competitor in West Coast Eagles who basically dominate the city and are doing their best to make sure they continue to dominate the city as is their responsibility. And we're doing battle. What we did, we were able to improve quite quickly on the field. We went from 2 wins to 9 wins to 13 wins. And so that when that happens, it does make your job a lot easier as a CEO. So building some momentum in and around your team was a key part of it. And then all of a sudden we had to match that opportunity with some capability in regard to strategically building the organisation. And that took a little bit more time. And it was also riding the wave. There was a mining boom in WA at the time too. So that obviously all helped. But all of a sudden we're playing in front of full stadiums, and we created a thing called the Purple Haze, and we basically made a decision to embrace our difference. And we really, the word Freo became then part of everyone. It was very much a Perth word up until that time, whereas now it became an Australian word. The purple, even the theme song, which is Weird Little Number. We just embraced all aspects of it. I started playing AC/DC after games. There's a whole lot of things came out of that time, which I think influenced the way that we view sport now. We actually wanted to make it. We wanted the people who come to the games to feel as though they were part of the game, and we even spoke to the players about how they embraced the crowd and involved themselves in the crowd. because Freo up until that point in time hadn't been a very watchable footy team, and then we're starting to become a little bit more watchable through some terrific players and also some good results. And within a couple of years, we made the finals, and were able to build on that commercially, and it's now one of the stronger clubs in the competition. And so my reflection is it's probably strategically the thing I'm proudest of in that sense, as a club going from something to nothing, from nothing to something, which it's been able to continue that positioning.
Looking over your stuff in what you're doing at Design CEO.
Yeah.
You drive a lot of, I guess, thought around three main questions you ask yourself as a leader. Do you want to go through a bit of the where they come from and what those questions are and what the meaning is for you?
It actually came from my experience in Freo, where I wrote down, it was just I'm a big journal keeper, and I wrote down these three questions, and I'm not sure where they actually came from. I think they came from it was actually a poet who I enjoy his work, a guy by the name of David White, and I never... He was thinking of the questions as it relates to life, but I was thinking of it more as it related to what I was actually doing at the time. And the first question was, and I try to ask the questions every 6 months of myself and reflect upon what they then would look like in 6 months' time. So I'd refresh myself. The first question is, what does the role expect of me? Having absolute clarity, or as much clarity as you can, as to what the role expects of you in that context as a CEO, as a leader. It was more as much the leadership question as anything. So therefore, what if I'm going to walk around with the title CEO and hand out the business card CEO? Really, what does that mean?
Yep.
And in a deeper way, not just in regard to the best office, the nicest. The nicest car type stuff. You
weren't listing KPIs and that kind of thing.
There's the human values stuff. What it does, and therefore, and things that came out of that question, for example, was not to think that every situation that confronted, because there's a lot of ambiguity in and around sport, and there's a lot of times where you simply just don't know what to do. Is not presenting myself as someone who always knew the answers, and that was a key thing. Whilst having confidence that you could create a conversation which would give us the best chance of finding those answers, but not always thinking you had the answers. Then the next stage is the next question is, what do I expect of the role? And this question's not asked very often. It's an unusual question because the role has an obligation to you as well. This is not a one-way conversation here. So if you find yourself in a situation where there's some part of this role which is demanding something of you which you don't feel comfortable about, and every role is going to demand sacrifices in some shape or form, particularly a leadership role. But if those sacrifices are things which are intrinsic to who you are, well, you've got to then question whether, in fact, that's worth it.
Yep.
From that perspective. And often I can remember sitting there interviewing coaches, and often the difference between the coaches you wanted and the coaches who you weren't sure about was the demands that they made of you. So you're interviewing them, but they're being more demanding of you in the conversation.
Yep.
And the story I often tell is when I was CEO at Melbourne, it was immediately post-merger, and Joe Gutnick was president of the club. And we were, and he'd been a controversial figure already up until that time. But the final part of the interview, when we've gone through it, and Neil Danaher's the preferred candidate, is to be interviewed by Joe. So I'm sitting there with Neil Danaher and Joe Gutnick, and Joe leans forward and he says to Neil, what will you do, Neil, when we lose 6 games in a row? And Neil leant forward even further and he said, don't worry about me, Joe. What will you do? Yeah. And I remember thinking, that is just the most remarkable, confident, I know what I'm about person,
yep.
but I'm not sure what you're about.
Yeah,
I know what I do. I will behave in a way which is appropriate to whatever the challenge is at the time, and it'll be done without emotion. It'll be done in a really pragmatic, practical way, but I'm not sure what you're going to do.
Yeah.
So you need to answer this question of me. And from that point onwards, I thought it is well within your rights. If you're going to go and work for someone, you should be demanding of the organisation. And if the organisation's not prepared to honour that, well, you need to then question whether, in fact, you should be working there, particularly as a leader. And when you're the CEO, one of the great things you work out is you're actually not the boss. You think you are going to be the boss, but you've actually got a board. You've got you've got people who are working for you who are far more expert at what they do than what you are in their particular area. So you're not going to tell them what to do. You have to play that role where often it's the invisible hand, where you're obviously guiding and you're influencing and these things. But very rarely can you just march in and go, we're doing this. It doesn't work that way. And the final one is, what do I expect of myself? And that question comes back to that. Which part of yourself are you prepared to give up, or which part of yourself aren't you prepared to give up as part of doing this job? If you're giving up your health, if you're giving up your family, if you're giving up, critical passions that you have for other things in life as part of doing the job, again, you've got to question it. So those three questions become quite important. What does the role expect of me? What do I expect of the role, and what do I expect of myself? And to put them in your diary and have them asked and answered every 6 months or so will give you a very strong sense of where you're at as a leader at any time.
I feel like, I've written down the question. I feel like I don't know the answer from what you're saying, but how do you balance the like you were saying before, the nuts and bolts of business and operations that has to get done with the relationships and managing people is the wrong term, but working with people and getting those outcomes? How much of a role of the CEO is in the nuts and bolts piece, but then also just making sure the people that are working for you can do the job and you're there for them and that kind of thing?
I think it was Steve Jobs who said it was something along the lines that the most creative thing you can do is find and develop the people who you believe are capable of fulfilling the vision for the organisation. So I think where people often make the mistake when they look at sporting clubs is they look at the team and they go, well, I see the team and I know that elite sporting clubs are all about the team, as in how do we get a high performing team out on the ground, which gives obviously the best chance of winning. But the team is ultimately an outcome. Whilst it needs to play to a game plan and these things, there's a strategic element to all of that. So people will often ask me to come in, can you come and talk to my team about being a good team? But the fact is that because it's an outcome, it becomes, I'll come and give you a talk, but I don't expect any change, really. Yep. People might feel good, they'll write a few notes and feel nice. The difference between what I see in business and what I see in elite sport is that sport is fundamentally about two things. It's about the talent, getting the right people, and it's about the teaching or coaching. So if we get the talent piece right, and the line I like to use is what the eye can't see. It's the special element that people have that isn't the obvious stuff. We can look at their expertise, we can look at their experience, but you want to know about their essence. What sort of human being they are. And the people who I look back on over 25 years as a CEO who really influenced me in regard to that, it was about the person they were. They became great experts, there's no doubt. And because they were around it for a long time, they had really rich experiences. But it was really the human beings that they were. And the other thing that the great people in that way, people of very high or strong essence, is they're great learners. And so therefore, if you create a teaching mindset within your organisation, well, they're the ones who are going to benefit from it the most. And so if you come from a place where you say it's all about getting the right people and it's all about giving them the best chance to learn, the team stuff will sort of work itself out eventually. And most of the environments that I was involved with were when the clubs were, on their knees, really. So it became almost immediately about the people. And most of the times when I went into the organisations, your first expectation from the outside looking in is there mustn't be many good people here because they're not performing very well. Well, almost inevitably I found the opposite. And it was actually a matter of giving or focusing on some of the teaching element, stop talking, start teaching as a leader, And people just grew. And I look back now, even, I had a difficult time at Melbourne the last stint, but some of the people who came out of the organisation at that time, the core of them are still working there, or they're doing better jobs than what they were, or not better jobs, they've come through the system. They're doing senior roles elsewhere. And so, and a lot of those same people were people who, when I went there, said, "Oh, they mustn't be any good because we're no good."
Yep.
And so, without the long way around your question is, it's just always focus on getting the people piece right, and then if you get the people and the talent piece right, and when I talk about talent, I don't just talk about what they can do. I'm talking about their integrity and their intent and those sorts of things. People who want to learn. Now, Luke Hodge going to Brisbane at the moment is both a teacher and a student. He needs to be in learner mode as he goes up north, not just in as well as being a teacher as in terms of his experience. And that's what makes him a pretty special leader.
There was a bit of banter and conversation around the Super Bowl with the Philadelphia Eagles. They won, great underdog story, and the social media team at like midnight, they signed off and said, "Hey, we're going on the field to celebrate, enjoy." And there was a bit of banter around in the industry of should they be doing it, should they be covering everything, or should they be allowed to enjoy it? Like my take was, sport is a tough business. You do long hours, for this little sliver of reward that might be a big game win and that kind of thing. How from someone on the inside, how different is sport in that sense? And what's your take on sort of that sort of space?
No, they had a job to do. That's my take. So their job is to do that piece of the work as well as they can. If your enjoyment in your role and how much enjoyment they get from it relates to that hour and a half or 2 hours of drinking champagne, whatever it might be, well, you're in it for the wrong reasons. Your job at that point is to present for the people who are the most important human beings in the organisation, those who have aligned their personal identity with the club, and that's the people who support your club.
Yep.
It's to actually look after them. They're the people who I'd say most of them have done it harder than the person working in the social media team. The social media team are probably getting well paid to do the work on a day to do a particular job. The people who are sitting in the stadium who have paid a big whack of money to come and support their club, or if they can't afford it, are probably giving a higher percentage of what their personal salary is to support their club, which has enabled them to go and play in a Super Bowl and to win it. They're the people who needed to be looked after. If the game is nothing, if it's not for the people who love it, and I put identity as the number. So when I talk about what sporting clubs are about, the first point I always make is identity.
Yep. Where
people come up to you and they say, "I'm a Richmond supporter," before I know their name, before I know their kids' names, before I know that. And I'd say if you're and I'm a little bit of an exception because I've actually worked in other environments. But once I left the game, I became a Richmond supporter again because that's the club I grew up with, and that's where my heritage is. That's where my personal folklore is.
Yep.
And so from that point of view, they were the people who have stuck with you, and particularly in that club, who needed to be. They were the ones who deserved to have this moment presented to them in a way. And, you can argue that those people were probably looking after themselves pretty well at that time. But there'll be plenty of time for the social media team to have an evening out or a night out or get, go on the owner's yacht or something,
I understand your point around that. And I think for mine, it was a little bit of like the sign off, maybe it was a bit too direct.
Yeah.
In the saying that, but the other piece was, giving that sign off as a signpost to say we're not going to be, posting stuff because there's every chance that everything that's available was not postable.
Yeah.
As you might have, seen behind the scenes, but and lets the fans. And again, what I looked at, most of the feedback from the fans was, "Way to go, guys. Thanks a lot. Keep up the good work. We've loved everything you've done." And they were capturing a lot. And I think that for mine, like and again, it might have been 2 or 3 hours of them having fun with the rest of the organisation that was doing it.
Yeah.
They were back on the tools 6 hours later and stuff like that. So
no, it's an interesting one in that it's a sometimes things there's a lot of mythology around the game as to how things happen and why they happen, and one of the great things about people who have been on the outside of sporting clubs when they come into sporting clubs is they realise they're just vulnerable, fallible, people making errors all the time. I can remember also where I was always very fortunate because my father was involved in the game. A lot of the heroes of the sport were part of my everyday, and I got to see them, drinking beers in my lounge room, in Swayfield Road, Mount Waverley as a kid, or waking up if there'd been a bit of a night out with a few of the boys that stayed overnight. And so I got to sense what that was actually like
and demystified it.
Demystified it, yeah. So, from that point of view, I'm not. It's not a punishable offence, and it's not a whatever. I'm just thinking that if we ever move away from the fact that the most important individuals within the organisation are the ones who have actually decided, and probably it's a little bit different in the US because it's often aligned to the city that you actually live in.
Yep.
But if you aren't giving them the best experience, that's what we're all about, giving them the best experience, because they're the ones who have just... given, often our sporting club is the one real positive thing in their life. You can get people who have got pretty ordinary existence, but, and I was in Swan Street watching the Tigers after the game, and she did get a bit messy. But the only thing I could relate
they didn't have to put Crisco oil on the telephone poles like they did in Philadelphia to stop people pulling down telephone poles.
No, it wasn't quite that, but it was coming out of a hotel around midnight in Swan Street. There was a capsicum spray smell in the air. There was obviously some stuff that happened.
Yeah.
The only thing I could liken it to would be if Brazil won the World Cup or something similar to that. It was a wonderful, wonderful feeling, and particularly I was sharing it with my family who loved the Tigers, and we all had our lace-up jumpers on and these things. It was a great experience. But the one thing that you realise was that there were people who pretty basic, tough existence have just had the best day of their whole lives. Yeah. And perhaps they weren't also sitting there watching their Twitter feeds either.
I think that's what presents the opportunity, because the way the media cycle runs now, whether it's here in Australia or whether it's in the US, the coverage leading up to a big game, there's every single show, everyone's previewing it.
Yeah.
And then the Monday after, there's a few spots in the paper. There's no more TV shows. No. There's no, after you win, you go, I want to watch the review show. I want to watch them on the couch talking about and nothing's there.
Nothing's there, yeah.
And,
that's a good opportunity.
It's a bit of a vacuum. And so I think, Brad and the guys at Richmond did a really good job of extending it. And I think the guys at the Eagles are doing the same. That's the opportunity for the club to say,
it is.
Because all the fans are going, I just want more. I want more. And all of those snippets that you captured on the big day can be, they can go for 6 months.
And that's where it's actually being in an organisation where when you have that type of success, when I do the strategies of all as you go through various phases, I always build strategies around 4 phases, which is similar to what an AFL club can be in. And the first one is I call it the right to play. Are we competitive enough that we justify being part of this competition? If I've been involved in at times where the games that our team is putting out are almost unwatchable. You're just non-competitive in this environment. The second phase is I call it in the game, as in it's half time in a game of footy. You don't want to be 10 goals down. Are we in the game here? Are we a chance? And the third phase, which was always in sport, was the premiership quarter. We always called it the premiership quarter, which it can just go either way for you. And often you can get stuck in that phase where you're not sure whether you're good enough to go to the next level or you have to go back into a previous phase. And there was actually a bit of a fear that Richmond were in that. Can they actually take it to the next level? And the final phase, I call it a game never won, because even when you win it,
1 week later you're in trade week. You know, so, but that's if you're in the game. That's if you're working in it on a day-by-day basis. But that's the reality of our business. So you and I could be we could be playing the house down here, but what we're actually worried about is the next game. You know, we're worried about the next thing. But for the supporters, they've got 3, 4, 5, 6 months, to call themselves the premiership team. And I've been, again, from a family point of view, very fortunate. My sister married a mad keen doggy supporter, and she had 3 boys. They've all had the best experience of their whole life in their 20s to see their team win the premiership. And then, for the rest of the family, they've seen the Tigers win it. So there's the whole Schwab family's basking in the reflected glory of their footy teams at the moment. In a way that we perhaps never thought we would, because the Doggies and the Tigers had been such a long stint. But as people who are in the game, our responsibility is, if Richmond aren't unbelievably well prepared coming into trade week, despite the fact that they've won the grand final, and that is a constraint that they have to work in because they've been in grand final mode. If they're not 100% prepared, well, they're doing a disservice to the very people who are celebrating at that particular time.
Yeah. A few people listen that are either students or looking to get into the game, get into sports business. I love the term that Ted Johnson talks about, people trying to get in, and they're those, he calls them jock sniffers, because they see the glamour and they just want to hang out with the athletes. And he goes, they don't last very long. No, they don't. But what kind of advice do you have for people either who want to get in or potentially who are already in the game now and want to escalate their career?
Yeah, I think you always have to test your pure love of the game. There's a lot of people who like the idea of working in the game because it's attractive and what they see, as you mentioned. But what they're doing is they're basically just providing their expertise to the sport. And once they're in it, they realise that the day-to-day is not much different to what they did previously. They get a little bit closer to the games from time to time, and that's a bit of fun, and there's lovely energy in and around footy clubs. But they're also, if the footy club's going no good, there's not many harder places to work either. Yep. Try and be the receptionist of a footy club when you get beaten by 100 points. There wouldn't be many worse jobs in footy, or being in charge of social media.
Yeah, having to read all those comments.
Yep. You do, and not personalise it. And you do, because you and it's hard because you're the people who are actually, you understand the amount of effort and work which is actually going in to try and get it right. And in a sporting, where a sporting organisation is fundamentally different. So you and I in our businesses, we can both do really well. We can sit here and talk about how you do your business, as we were before, and how I do my business, and we try to learn from each other. And most of the time in sport that actually happens. But on match day, you win, I lose, or I win, you lose. It's a 50-50. It's a one or the other in that sense. So the game is either winning or misery, really, in most cases. The leadership needs to bridge that gap between the winning and misery and make sure we get wisdom from the wins as well as we do the losses, these sorts of things. That's one of the great opportunities for leaders. But when you're in that environment and you don't get to influence that outcome, it can be a pretty tough go. So what that actually means is the people who survive in the game have to have what I describe as a very, very high, what's the term I'm looking for? It's almost a depth of understanding of just what elite sport is about, as in they are highly performance-oriented places. They sit on the cusp of what I'd call collegiality and accountability, as in we want you to feel good about being involved in the place, but we have to have an absolute accountability for performance. And what that actually means is that we will love you, excuse me, we will love you until such time as there's someone who's cheaper or better than you. That's just the reality of it. And not many people are built for that.
Yep.
And that's what tests them, because they see, someone who they're putting their arm around one day being then shoved out of the door, and then a pimply-faced kid coming in replacing him the next day. And so if you have to survive the game on a long-term basis, sure, if you want to do it for 5 to 10 years, great. But if you want to make it your career, you have to absolutely understand what the essence of the sport is actually about. And you have to have a sophisticated view of that, and you have to be built for it. Because if you if you are questioning that on a daily basis, you won't have a very good job. You should go and work somewhere else.
Yep.
But for those who end up being lifers in the sport, they're prepared for that.
And I think it's also, and I've seen it, people coming into sport, doesn't matter what sport it is, say from a corporate, is having an understanding of being adaptable, because there's nothing like, a two-game losing streak to throw out all the plans, or a big player signing, or a crisis that's happening, and discussing with people who are in corporate marketing and comms and that kind of thing. Here's our plan for the next 12 months. It's like, we could throw that out next week if this happens. And so being adaptable to that change, being agile enough to handle it is super important. And that pressure is sometimes tough for people who want that. I'm following the plan, ticking off all the boxes. Yeah,
and that's not for you. If you're like that, that's not the game for you. And I can remember times where, you'd get without sort of making this frivolous, but I can remember people that ring in and say, "Do you want the good news or the bad news?" And knowing that whatever's going to happen isn't my life for the next week is going to be on whatever that issue is.
Yeah.
The good news is you're not in jail.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty open scope what the bad news might be. So you then realise that you've got about half an hour at that time to work out how we're going to manage this period. And that went from early days being very much minimisation to let's get the facts out as quickly as we possibly can. But the difficulty when you're in the leadership role is you don't know what the facts are.
Yeah.
And you are up for grabs because you're going to be out there presenting yourself as someone trying to present the facts, knowing that you don't know what the facts actually are. And then when someone, 2 hours later, there's more facts and you just go, I didn't quite, So you want to be on the front foot. You want to be presenting yourself in a very authentic and honest and open fashion. And the good news with that is that what it meant, because we all got caught out on that at different times, you could actually sit down with individuals and say, look, we just need to know what the facts are here.
Yep.
But often, unfortunately, the facts weren't even well known by them because it might have been that they had too much to drink or something had actually happened at that time. But there were different times, and we had one year at Melbourne where we had unbelievably complex issues with, for example, it was when Jimmy was very ill. We had Liam Jara in a really complex situation. These were weekly, scenarios which we were trying to deal with particular empathy to the individuals, but recognising that there's a public place.
In your role as CEO and as a leader in that space, how much are you trying to deal with that situation as well as protect as much of the business from that situation, so they can at least be, there's another game coming up. Yeah. There's things that have to be done. How much are you trying to manage it as best possible without affecting the whole organisation?
Yeah, no, that is a challenge, particularly if one of the individuals is at the heart of the organisation, as in an important player.
Yeah.
And that relates to performance, and so it's the balance always is to take the long-term view and as much as the short-term view might be, gee, we've just dropped 4 goals out of our team this weekend. And I think that's where it changed. Initially it was just, whatever it takes to get the player out there. And that became that's a very indulgent, selfish, it's not good for anyone way to get to the point where it was more to we've got to do what is the right thing. But the right thing is not, there's a lot of ambiguity in that. And even the work I do now is about how leaders become good at ambiguity, how they become good at conflict. High trust organisations are really good at ambiguity. These issues that we're talking about are much easier to manage when everyone's got high trust, as in I trust that the coach can keep the player group in good shape whilst we deal with this. I trust that our media team are on top of this thing, they're going to handle it in a really positive way because they've got a good experience and good sophistication and good intellect in terms of these types of issues. I trust that the board will be on board with whatever decision I take at this point, even though it's going to be a 50-50. You know, there's no absolutes here. I trust that that I will deal with this in a fashion personally, which is operating and acting in the best interests of the organisation, not in my personal best interests. You know, I want to survive as a CEO out of all of this, you know, that type of stuff. If you've got a high trust organisation, well, these decisions become much, much easier because we can deal with the ambiguity knowing that whatever the outcome is, that we're still on track. It's when you realise you're faced with when you're faced with an issue, which this has the capacity to throw us off track because it's going to divide the board, or it's going to separate you from the coaching group, or the player group might get they might be disassociated because they feel that you've either supported the wrong person or you should have been more supportive of that person. These things aren't easy, and they're all the things that you weigh up, and they're the very things that you used to wake up in the morning. Just when your consciousness actually hits you, and whatever swear word comes straight into your head before you've had any other thought for the day, and it's interesting because it was that feeling as a leader that led me now to create what I've now created, which is the Design CEO, because I was always looking for something which could help me with that. And I could never find it. And this was a journey which took me to all the great sporting clubs of the world, and it took me I went to Harvard and I studied at Melbourne Business School. I did all these programs, but nothing which related to that feeling as a CEO, where you just woke up and you thought, there's all this complexity, there's all these things swirling around in my head at this time. I've got no idea what I'm going to do here, but I've got to walk in the office in an hour and a half's time with a sense of what we do next. And that was both the compelling part of leadership in that environment, but also the part where when you're driving to work and you saw someone sweeping the streets or someone cleaning the windows, and you're thinking, "Gee, I'd love to have your job right now." They were, "Do you want to swap jobs for the next 2.5 hours?" That was that feeling.
Well, thank you very much. I'll finish off with the Sports Geek closing 5. You've obviously got a long history in sport. Do you remember the first sports event you ever attended?
Yeah, that was the first sports event was walking up the stairs of the MCG with my dad, watching Richmond play Melbourne at the MCG. I watched the game with a fellow by the name of Billy Brown, who was a little forward pocket rover for the Tigers. Must have been injured on the day. And I couldn't believe, and I fell in love. I just absolutely fell in love with the sport. Even my parents would say I was here and there about the game up until that time. But I remember seeing the green grass and how good the Richmond jumpers looked, and just fell in love. And so it was that. And then that same year, I think it was might have been a rest of the world game. It was when the South African tour didn't happen. I watched a test match at the MCG, and I remember being enamoured with cricket as well. But it was the Tigers and then footy which got me, and then they swapped at some point. But I fell in love with Richmond Footy Club before I fell in love with the game.
You would have been to a fair few sports events over the year in different parts of the world. Do you have a favourite food or a go-to food when you go to a game?
I'm actually pretty healthy these days, but I'm probably still just a good old-fashioned bucket of chips. And probably I think also the jam donuts leaving the footy as a kid were pretty special. The burnt roof of the mouth and all that stuff. That was just the smell as you were coming out. In South Australia when I was in recruiting, it was actually the barbecues around the ground. They used to have the good old-fashioned barbie, so you could go and get there, a bit like the Bunnings. You get the sausage in a bread at the Parade or one of those, or at Unley Oval, one of those. That was pretty special.
What's the first app you open in the morning?
First app, it's a good question. LinkedIn. Yeah, now it's changed. It'd be LinkedIn. I love Instagram as well because of my art background. Now I've studied art for the last few years, and I really like that because I follow a lot of artists, and they're really prepared to put their work out there. It's such a visual medium, and I find artists that way, and then I go chasing him.
It's a bit of a rabbit hole, but it is a good way. Like, they're not just saying, "Here's my finished artwork." Here's the start of it.
You get to see. I love a backstory. You know, what we've talked a lot about today is the backstory and how did you end up with that way? And then you say, well, this was an influence here. This was an influence here. I lucked in on this. There was a bit of an happy accident there. You know, I stuffed that one over there, and I ended up in this place now.
Yeah, it's funny. A former NBL player, Adam Ballinger, I caught up with him a couple of years ago, and he was coming out of a career and I said, what do you want to do? He goes, I like drawing cartoons and that's what I like doing. I said, well, that's what you do. He goes, how? I said, well, just start drawing and share them on Instagram. And so he's doing all these, photos, drawings and cartoons of NBA characters and that. And sure enough, people are finding it. It's getting shared. He's sharing his designs on T-shirts and stickers and that kind of stuff. And he's just following what he wants to do.
Yeah, and that was and my mum's an artist and Dad was a footy administrator. And as a kid, I was always drawing footballers and superheroes and these sorts of things. And so most of my art now is quite figurative, and it comes very much from that. So it's almost got a little bit of that comic book element to it. And but I learnt an enormous amount just being an artist full time for a period of time, and particularly on the ambiguity, because you've got to push. If you're putting your art out there and it's obvious, well, you're basically discrediting the person looking at your art. So you've got to put art out there which people might love or hate, and that's not an easy place to be. You know, where
because everyone wants to be liked.
Yeah, you do. We prefer a like than a dislike. You know, and so but to create art, which is you stop being an artist the minute you stop the conversation in many ways, and I think the same as a leader, you stop being a leader the minute you start stopping the conversation. You've actually got to encourage the conversation. You've got to bring it to an end at some point, as in you've got to make a call, you've got to make a decision. But if you come in and blunt any decent discussion about these issues, well, you're not doing your job properly.
You talked a lot about learning, over the years. Yeah. Is there someone that you follow or read that you suggest the listeners
I love listening to Tim Ferriss. Every time I listen to a Tim Ferriss podcast, I end up with about 5 books I'm going to read or YouTubes I'm going to look at. So I find that because it's just it's always at you, and you can take or leave, which part suits you, but very much his. A poet by the name of David White, Whyte. He's a favourite. He's great to listen to on Audible as well, because he narrates his own books, and he's got this. He's from he's got Yorkshire, but I think there's also Irish in one side. I think it's his mother's side of the family. So he's got he's got a lovely rhythmic way of speaking. So David White had a huge influence on my thinking, and often it's the metaphor which is important when you're trying to teach. It's if you come up with a good model, as in a framework which you can actually use. If you can come up with a really cool metaphor, that's really valuable. And sport offers a lot of metaphor, but so does art. And I use David White's stories as part of the metaphor when I'm talking to people about some of the leadership learnings.
You might already answered this, but I'll ask it anyway. What social media platform is your MVP?
Yeah, LinkedIn's most important for me because I'm mainly discussing my conversations with the leaders. But because of the art, Instagram, and probably now Facebook, because of the way you can actually really work through who might be interested in what you're doing. So I like the fact that you can do that. So I'm very much learning as I go in regard to it. I've always seen it as a means of having the conversation. I'm finding Twitter a little bit challenging. I don't use it very much anymore because I just find it.
It's very noisy now than it was when we met. Like when we met, we found each other first.
Yes.
And there was conversation, and it was a bit more town hall.
Yeah.
And now it's a bit more broadcast. And, I'll put my hand up that I broadcast on it because that's what the platforms devolved to, I guess, a little bit. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see if it does snap back, whether things like live sport and being able to pick it up makes that conversation different.
And I think it's also probably the anonymity of and it's going to sound funny, the anonymity of the toxicity, if you like, and as much as, because I'm not in the game as I was, there was a certain price I was prepared to pay when someone came back with something which was clearly put there just to hurt you for no other reason other than to hurt you. And I thought, that's a little bit of the price I pay. Whereas now I think, well, I don't have to have that. So maybe I'm better off not. But then I put a thing up just recently about a video I did about a story growing up with Francis Burke and Royce Hart, and I got a lovely little response from Loretta Burke in London, Francis's daughter, and so then I think, well, maybe there is a little place for this. That definitely warmed the heart.
But I think that's where in the last 2 years that LinkedIn has improved.
Yes,
and the fact that it doesn't have the anonymous. You know everybody, or there's real identities mostly behind most of the accounts. It doesn't have the problem that Twitter does.
Yes.
And the fact that, you are seeing traction for good content, whether it's a good video or, you shared the image with Tom Hafey, recently, and everyone relates to the message, relates to Tom as a hero and that kind of thing, and it fits. I'm the same. I'm finding, greater connection and connectivity with the LinkedIn audience than probably any other audience that I've got at the minute.
Yeah, and I think that's all credit to them, really, in lots of ways, because it sort of went nowhere for a period of time. It was like people just pumping up their resumes. And it comes back to that. My advice to anyone on those platforms is that, it'll say, again, use the 3 words I used before. It'll say something about your expertise because you've been to whatever uni, you've done whatever jobs. It'll talk to your experience. But the value in LinkedIn is when you see something about someone's essence, about something they really believe in.
Yep.
And not, I'm happy for people to repost other people's stuff and all those things. But I want to know what you think.
Yep.
What is your take on that? If you're going to post an article, tell me why it meant something to you. Not that there was, it's really interesting, must read or anything like that. And tell me you really related to the fact that this person struggled with this but bounced back from that and came up with it out of that constraint or out of that challenge, became a better person. Whatever your... Because that one proves to me that you actually read it for a start, and secondly, it meant something which aligned with who you are, what your values are. And then I'm much more likely to then take the time to read whatever that article was.
Yep. And for mine, if you are in the space and want to better network, you could be putting out your own stuff, but placing comments or responding to people's stuff with genuine comments, not love it, Cam, you do form a deeper tie, and it is over time people go, oh, yep, I know so-and-so, they provide really good insight on this. Now I know what they're doing. You start following them a little bit closer, which is what early Twitter was, and I think that's now available in LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, it is. So I've become a bit of a fan, and really, to be honest, it's just I'm looking to find leaders, I'm looking to find CEOs. Well, 95% of them are on LinkedIn in one shape or form, and it's about having it, as I said, the proper conversation, not just that. If there's 5 layers, you at least be prepared to go down to layer 2 or 3. Don't start layer 1.
So that allows us to wrap this up. So where can people find you? What's the best place to connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn. Yeah, so just Cam Schwab at Cameron Schwab at LinkedIn, and Twitter is Cam Schwab, and Instagram is Cam Schwab, SCHWAB, and also my website is designceo.com.au, and probably the main piece of work is working with CEOs and leaders. I bring them into and you're going to have the experience in a few weeks' time, but the bring them in and give a piece of the core of what my thinking is, and it's very much comes from the learned experience. There's a lot of people who teach leadership who have a lot to offer, but often it's not from their own experience; it's from what they've gathered and understand from other people. So mine's about the 25-year learned experience with the frameworks of, so it can actually be then something that if you turn up, and I'd be very disappointed if you walked away without 4 or 5 concepts and ideas that you wouldn't from that point onwards be looking at to execute within your own business and your own organisation.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it, and thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
All right, cool. Thanks very much for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Download our Facebook campaigns guide at sportsgeekhq.com/FB campaigns.
Thanks again to Cam Schwab. you can actually send him a tweet at Cam Schwab, SCHWAB. A wealth of experience as a CEO of a footy club, and he does a terrific job of translating that to both sports, obviously, but also taking those sports analogies and across to business and what it means to be a CEO. And as I said in the intro, I went to Cam's Design CEO workshop, and it was an absolute blast. Terrific content presented by Cam. We dived a lot deeper into the stuff that we were discussing on the podcast around what he thinks a CEO needs and the tightrope that a CEO has to walk. So if you are in a leadership position or at a C-level or a CEO and looking for some advice and assistance and challenge yourself to keep learning, I highly recommend reaching out to Cam and having a chat and asking him about what he's doing. What I want to do in post the interview and then post the Design CEO workshop was to tackle Cam's questions that he says he asks himself in his little quarterly reviews. I was going to do it on the podcast. So his first question, what does this role expect of me? So what does Sports Geek expect of me? And for mine, my answer to that is to help the sports industry drive results from digital and do that by building digital fan bases to present a case that you've got an audience, whether that be in social media terms, in different social media platforms, or driving data. So building out an email database. So building out that case to say, these are our fans, we know who they are, we know what they do. And then looking for ways to build revenue from those audiences. And it's either transactional, how can we sell more tickets, the cheeks and the seats, how we can sell more jerseys, merchandise and the like via those digital fan bases, or how can we build revenue from those digital assets that we've bought, whether putting branding on the content we're developing or developing campaigns, which is the sponsorship piece, which is what we've built Sports Geek campaigns for. So that's what the role expects of me to help produce. What do I expect of the role? What do I want to get out of working at Sports Geek, working in this role? For me, I just love working with smart and innovative people. The good thing about running your own business is you get to pick and choose who you work with, and I choose to work with people who are smart, want to push the boundaries and challenge me as much as I challenge them. And so that's what gets me up at the early hours of the morning for an interview with people around the world, or up late at night for likewise, or working on campaigns in different parts of the world. That's what I expect of the role, to be challenged and to work with smart and innovative people. So what do I expect of myself to be able to do that role? Stay healthy, and it's something that I've put more of a focus on recently, challenged by a good friend Jesper when I was in Denmark to get back in the gym and get healthy again. So I'm starting to do that. I'm at my standing desk right now. My hamstrings are sore, but I know when I am healthy, I'm a better performer and a better person to be around. So one, it's I have to stay healthy. The other one, which was a big part of Cam's workshop, was to keep learning, and it's something that I'm always trying to do. I always, from a tactical and being on the tools and the functional capability of what I do, I have to keep learning. I have to keep up to date on what's happening. I have to keep my tech skills at a level where I can continue to understand the changes in the technology. But I did like one of the things that Cam brought up in his workshop is also having the ability to unlearn, to be able to rewire the thinking, see things from other people's point of view. One of the things I do a lot of is looking at other industries and what they're doing and seeing how it could be applied back to sport. So keeping learning, and then the last thing that I expect of myself is to be helping others, and I do that via producing the podcast and teaching people and bringing them into my world, but then also learning from my guests like Cam and the over nearly 200 odd guests that I've had on the podcast, or whether it's be facilitating the Sports Biz Slack, or whether it's internally working with my staff like Meg and Jolie, who are helping produce content like the Sports Geek News and the guides that we're producing. So that's what I expect of myself. If that fits in your world and you think I can help you, as always, drop me a line, Sean at sportsgeekhq.com, or book in a time for a phone call, sportsgeekhq.com/phone call. Just before wrapping up, really starting to ramp up the social media athlete training piece and what that offer is. We've done a few sessions where we do the group session with the players to talk about the different opportunities for them as athletes, as building out their digital brands, but also what platforms work best for them and which ones they should do or could do, which ones are going to fit better for what they do and what their personality is. We do spend a fair bit of time talking about privacy and understanding privacy and security to avoid hacking and also to protect the privacy of their friends and family. And then the other piece that we've been adjusting and tweaking the presentation for is making sure that the players understand the team message, the team brand, the team ethos, and so that starts to pervade what they're doing online. And so it's the rising tides lift all boats. If you've got all of your athletes sending out the same message, both it's good for your team brand, but then it's good for the personal brand of the athlete. So if you've got an athlete group or if you've got a coaching group, we've done some sessions with coaches that pretty much use social media to monitor and keep an eye on their players, but they want to understand how they're using the platforms and why they're using the platforms. We're happy to do those kind of sessions as well with a coaching group. And one of the things that's come out of these sessions, especially in the Q&A part, has been, I guess, the development and the player-driven development of a social media policy where, you know, a team leader, once the discussion starts being had in the room, it becomes a little bit more open. They're a little bit maybe more willing to talk to me as an outsider. And they start formulating their own social media policy, whether that's we won't post X amount of hours before the game, or, hey guys, we've got to be very wary of doing this on these type of platforms. That's been a useful conversation because it only works if the players own it. So again, reach out if you've got an athlete group or a coaching group that you would like some training for. You can always go to sportsgeekhq.com. Social media athlete training is the URL. It's available on the website, and get in touch. I'm happy to. Last but not least, Comedy Festival time. The tickets are selling. April 12 and April 15, my two shows. So if you are in Melbourne and if you are coming down to the Comedy Festival, I'd love to see you in the audience. I think actually the April 12 show is available as a laugh pack, so you can get it at a discount if you're going to multiple shows. Please let me know that you're coming along. I'd love to know that you're in the audience. I'm not fazed knowing that there's going to be people I know at the audience, and I welcome hecklers. Having an absolute ball doing it, having a ball trying to put together more material and trying to figure out what's going to make the cut. But really looking forward to it. As always, please get in touch. If there's a question that you have, please send it through Sean at sportsgeekhq.com. Send me a tweet at Sean Callanan or at SportsGeek will get to me, or hit me up on the SportsBiz Slack, which is just past 1,300 people, and some really good conversations happening in there. As always, you're more than welcome to join the SportsBiz Slack community. Until next episode, my name is Sean Callanan, and you've been listening to Sports Geek.
Join over 1,000 sports business executives in Sports Biz Slack. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/Slack. Please share your fave episodes of Sports Geek on LinkedIn. Be sure to tag Sean Callanan.
Go to sportsgeekhq.com for more sports digital marketing resources.
Want to chat with Sean? Book a time for a call. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call.